My name is Alejandro Isa. I work for IUCN. I'm the director of the Environmental Law Center, which is based here in the city of Bonn. For those of you, IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, is a membership-based organization which brings together governments and civil society organizations. We were established in 1948, so we are celebrating this year our 70th anniversary. This is a very diverse, very large organization, approximately 1,300 members, state and non-governmental, and 13,000 experts that are organized around 6 commissions that deal with issues like species, environmental law, protected areas, communication, social policy, and so on and so forth. So having said that, having made that announcement on our organization, today, in this discussion forum, we would like to focus specifically on spatial planning for landscapes, as the title of the session indicates. In particular, we would like here to explore with you what happens at country level, as well as what are the existing regional and global strategies on this theme. We have selected 6 panelists that are here with us today, who will share their experience and their understanding on the matter with us. But before introducing the panelists, we will have 2 different panels, one after the other. I would like at this stage to ask my colleague, Ning Li, who is Program Officer at the Environmental Law Center here in Bonn, to let us know how we came to work on policy and legal and institutional aspects on this theme, and what have we done so far on this matter. So Ning, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. So as Alejandro said, we want to give you a quick overview about what brought the Environmental Law Center and many of the experts to Bonn, to this Global Landscape Forum. So this is where we started from the governance and legal point of view. IUCN updated the global guidelines on protected area legislation starting in 2007. And then from that point, we realized and we also saw the need of looking at legal issues and governance issues beyond just fixed space. So we start to talk about legal aspect of connectivity conservation. And we realized that this is, from the governance legal point of view, this is still at its very beginning. So after this theoretical study, we thought things has to be learned and exchange has to happen at the ground, at the country level. Because at the end of the day, what we do happens in a specific space in a country in most of the cases. So this is how we started with the Integrated Planning for Biodiversity Conservation and Climate Change project. It is a project funded by the German International Climate Initiative. So in this project, we basically want to look at a few elements, and particularly from the global commitments, the global tools, and the country solutions. It's supported by learning, by capacity building, and through dialogues and outreach, etc. So what we are looking at is put spatial planning at the center as the tool. What we want to see is whether this tool has its great potential of bringing in the alignment of biodiversity and climate change commitment at global level with actions at the country level. So you can see in each country, we have 4 countries implementing this project. In each country, a similar kind of national, local dialogue, capacity building, and outreach is happening. So we started the work in 2014 in 3 continents, 4 countries, and in 3 scenarios. So this is just a very brief overview about where we worked at the country level. In Colombia, which is one of the most biodiversity-rich countries in the world, we worked at 2 sites. These 2 sites, we focused very much on the relationship between protected area and local and municipality development. So the idea is to look at the relationship between protected area needs and the growth of urbanization. So we gained some experiences from there. And another case is in Tanzania and Zambia, in Africa. We very much focus on the Lake Tanganyika. And this particular focus is on protected area and its adaptation to climate change, how to ensure the resistance of the protected area to climate issues. So there, we supported protected areas and the local municipalities in coming up with climate change resilience strategies. So this is just some examples of showing what we have done in these 2 countries. My colleagues are here from the 2 countries, and if you want to know more information, we can share. We are very happy to share with you after the discussion. Last but not least, Vietnam. This is a country that is the 2nd largest rice exporting country of the world. And the rice policy is a national policy. So in Vietnam, my colleagues and government partners are working in the Mekong Delta. We focus very much on the relationship between nature conservation and agriculture, in particularly looking for nature-based solutions and sustainable agriculture. So in this pilot area, we promoted a strategy, land use strategy, focused on flood retention strategy. So other than the 4 specific sites, we look at internationally how we can use these specific experiences and link it with global commitments, global tools to come up with something that maybe can be applied in other countries as well. So we conducted an assessment of legal and policy frameworks in 16 countries. You may not see it very well, but it's where you see the dots are the 16 countries that we conducted the study. And we found it's very complicated, it's very diverse. Based on the study, we developed a set of capacity building materials. We want to use these sets of materials to give an introduction, which is a UNITA course, as well as more in-depth knowledge about what are the policy and legal requirements one need to know when it comes to the topic of land use. So tomorrow we will have a learning pavilion. There will be 2 IUCN sessions. One of them is to introduce the capacity building material on land use. So we will very much welcome you be there again. And at the end of the session, you will get a USB card with all the information, with all the materials, and you can use it, you can adapt it for your own purpose. So that's just a very brief introduction from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ning. Thank you for this introduction. But before you leave, I would like to see if there are any immediate questions to her. Raise your hands, please. If not, I will invite the first panel to join me. No questions? Good. Thank you very much. First panel is integrated by 3 distinguished speakers. The first one is Barbara Lausche. Barbara, could you please come to the front? The second one is Alfred Herberg. Please come to the front. And the third one is Stuart McGuinness. Barbara Lausche is an international environmental lawyer with more than 30 years of experience working with governments and international organizations worldwide. Since 2011, she has been director of the Marine Policy Institute at Mote Marine Laboratory and Aquarium in Sarasota in the United States, a non-profit marine science research organization which works worldwide with more than 200 staff and some 30 PhD scientists. She's an active member of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law and the World Commission on Protective Areas and its Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group. Dr. Alfred Herberg studied landscape planning, political and social sciences, and is now General Director and Vice President of the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation, BFN. The agency provides the German Environmental Ministry with professional and scientific assistance in all nature conservation and landscape management issues and in international cooperation activities. In the last 20 years, Dr. Herberg served and participated in several projects as a researcher and team leader in all fields of landscape planning. Finally, my colleague Stuart McGuinness is Global Director of the Nature-Based Solutions Group in IUCN, with overall responsibility for IUCN's work on ecosystems management, forests, water, gender, social policy, economics, and business and biodiversity. He has more than 30 years of broad experience in the area of natural resources management, biodiversity, conservation, and sustainable development. And more recently, he has worked extensively in national and international natural resource and climate change policy, and is recognized leader in the conceptual development and promotion of FLR, forest landscape restoration. To allow the discussions with the audience, I will have 2 Q&A sessions later on, but first of all, I would like to go to the speakers. Barbara, first of all. You are, as I said, when I introduced you, a policy and a legal expert working on both the terrestrial as well as the marine landscapes. Could you please tell us how you see the value and the potential of spatial planning for conservation and for climate change resilience at the landscape level? And also if you see any new development that we need to be aware of in this particular theme.
Thank you, Alejandro, and thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for having me here. What I'm going to do is briefly highlight about 6 points that come out of a new publication that we are still in draft, but it's almost published. It's in the proofing stage and was part of a 2-day workshop that we had here at the Law Center on integrated spatial planning. And my part was to produce a global study on policy and law instruments. Now, spatial planning, the way we are talking about it today in the Law Center, is broader than what it used to be when it was called maybe in the last century, when we focused on urban planning or land use planning, which was much more narrow. It wasn't a holistic thing. You usually started because you had a problem. There was too many people in the city without sewage, without housing, and so you tried to have housing and health and safety zoning issues, zoning tools. In addition, typically it was very isolated in one sector. It wasn't integrated. It also was a situation where it was very short term. You had to plan for your people now. We all appreciate with climate change, we're not planning only now. We're planning, well, IPCC tells us they can give us numbers to 2100. So we're planning 75 years or whatever. So those tools that we had in some countries, and especially in the EU countries, since the mid-1900s, they don't work by themselves anymore as we look at spatial planning. But we have so many other tools. We have the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans. We have the climate change plans. We have conservation plans. We have protected areas plans. We have community development plans, municipal plans. It goes on and on. That's all good. That's all good. For purposes of law and policy and institutional development, this is our base. But now we have to think about broadening the legal base as well as our intellectual base to be able to support the core new responsibilities governments and communities have to work and conserve biodiversity, adapt to climate change, mitigate climate change, and still improve their lives. So we need, in this book, we have new principles, new features for integrated planning, and that need to be legally grounded. They include broad participation, because we now know government regulation can't do it all. It has to be integrated across the sectors and across the levels of government. Needs to be long-term, 75 years. If you're an engineer and you're building a bridge, you need 75 years going forward to see where it's at. And we also, multidisciplinary, an effort to try to have some core common objectives across the sectors so they will work together. So the book that we're just coming out with has these basic outlines of what we need to be thinking about in new legislation or strengthened legislation or harmonized legislation. An important part of that, of course, is now requiring that conservation be part of spatial planning. Planning offices need to be ensured, reinforced, authorized to make sure that conservation plans of all the ranges that we have, even river basin plans, are integrated. And they can say to their minister, yes, this is part of my legal responsibility. Now, I wanted to quickly, in my few minutes, talk about some of the observations that become sort of key messages in the document. First of all, in a cross-sectoral way, we need to put in our legal framework and our policy framework the importance of mainstreaming climate change and biodiversity in spatial planning law. So it can't be segmented out. We need to make sure we are requiring the best available science information. And science is moving, so we need to have some flexibility for adaptation. We also need to not feel so uncomfortable about uncertainties in science. We have them, and politicians maybe say, well, I need to know if this is 99% gonna work. Well, maybe it's only 50% gonna work, or 60%, but it's the best shot we've got right now. So issues of uncertainty, we must still tackle them. We must have flexibility for adaptation. Planning adapts as population shift, climate shift, global change, and other areas shift. So we need that. We also need to be looking at broader public participation and community action. Community action not only that is part of a legal framework, but it is voluntary. There is much more voluntary stuff going on now that we've never had before. Specific tools, we have to move across sectors now. We can't just stay environmental. We need to work with development permit plans and with permits themselves and incentives, fiscal incentives, to get people to look at how taxes can be used, how incentive structures can be used to keep farmland in farms rather than converted to suburbia. Environmental assessments, but especially strategic environmental assessments.
And the last two, Barbara, last two, because I need to give the floor to the other panelists. Last 2 points, please.
Yes, the last 2 points, I want to shift to seascapes.
Okay.
The ocean is 70% of the planet.
Oceans.
It is containing, if we look at the deep sea and we go down 4,000 meters, 99% of the living space on the planet. It is producing 50% of our oxygen. And now the latest UNESCO science report says that the oxygen production is declining. Our fish stocks are declining. It has to do with climate change. Our next assignment must be seascapes and efforts to deal with the policy and law frameworks for integrated marine spatial planning. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you so much. Let's move to another angle on this, and I would like to ask Stuart. Stuart, you've been a key figure in the forest landscape restoration movement, I would say, from the very beginning. How do you see the linkage between spatial planning and forest landscape restoration, and also beyond, you know? And what can our organization, its partners, do more on this?
Okay, so thanks, Alejandro. Maybe just to explain a little bit on what forest landscape restoration is, and this features quite strongly here, but I'll just a quick recap. Again, the forest landscape restoration came around perhaps, 20 years ago. The discussion then on forests were very much about protecting forests and managing working forests. And the issue of restoration was a real blind spot. And when restoration was discussed, it was only about restoring or planting for industrial roundwood, really. And that was a contested space as well, the issues of plantation. When we took this all over, we said, well, hold on a minute, forests are multifunctional. Forests and trees are multifunctional, so it's not just blocks of forests, it's trees in landscapes are multifunctional. Therefore, what we're restoring shouldn't be just for roundwood or biomass or whatnot, it's to restore multiple functions. That immediately gets you into a landscape context that can't be delivered on a site base, and that needs some sort of planning or organizational framework. Where we are at the minute now, we've moved forward. With the government of Germany, we initiated the Bond Challenge 2011 to initially to have under the process of restoration 150 million hectares by 2020. We've exceeded that already. We've now got countries have committed, I think about 42 countries have committed over 170 million hectares. And from analysis that we're now doing through a global tool called the Bond Challenge Barometer of Progress, we reckon that about somewhere around 45% of those commitments are actually translated into on the ground and in policy, should I say, action. So we're actually so this isn't just the pilot. We're actually starting to see some movements, and there's several events that actually talk this through in detail. So to come to Alejandro's question, obviously one does need a planning framework, but I think one of the things where forest landscape restoration also came out with was actually realizing in that multiplicity of function, it represents a range of values that are important to society, not just the voices that are often heard in society, but those that are not heard. And so I'll be truthful, there was a concern initially about and again, one needs to look at and understand the history and the progress of spatial planning. And initially, spatial planning was very much an expert-driven. It was supposed to be neutral. I would argue it was anything but because it drove particular agendas. So we actually had concerns about how does one actually start to get a framework to think about how one undertakes and restores functionality, how that meets societal needs, but at the same stage that we don't get locked in this trap of having specific agendas, particularly of those whose voices heard most loudly, dominating those who don't. And this is particularly important because we are talking about land and landscapes. It's not just the forest, it's the lands, it's right across. Mm-hmm. So, and I must admit, if I was on this stage 20 years ago, I would, number one, have a lot less grey hair, but I would have also been saying that I was thinking of putting a paper, which I never did, called Against Planned Landscapes, because I was actually really concerned of this top-down lines on maps that actually configured that. Anyway, I say all that because I think, well, number one is to recognize that that spatial planning is important. Society needs to have something to frame its thinking. We need to have a basis where you can bring stakeholders together, but it can be a two-edged sword. It can be, and depending on the emphasis we put on it, it can be exclusive, so it'll be dominated by a few, or it can be inclusive. And I think we also need to be clear that it is not just, one of the things we often say as scientists is, oh, it's neutral. Well, it's not a neutral process. It can actually be dominated. So there's 5 things but in saying that, it's also needed. So there are 5 things that I would actually flag up that we have learned as we've gone through and applied spatial assessment processes. We've now got a tool called the Restoration Opportunity Assessment Method applied in 35 countries, I think, so far. We've assessed something like 400 million hectares for restoration opportunities. And I think I'd say a couple of things. Number one, specificity in local ownership and defining the challenge that needs to be addressed. Again, if you look at where we were coming from, we're looking at the issues of degradation. Now, there was a debate for a long time, there could be one framing of degradation. There can't. Degradation manifests itself in a very different way, let's say, in rural Malawi than it might in this part of Germany. Because it's the loss of services, and those services, people relate to those services in different ways. So there needs to be that specificity and local ownership in actually shaping and framing the challenges that we're looking at. The second point is, and I sort of mentioned this, so this is a follow-on for what I mentioned already, is in embarking in a spatial planning process, we really need to avoid that the process is co-opted from the start by a pre-identified or preferred set or configurations of land use. I think we need to be focusing on the outcomes, and Barbara's mentioned several of those, how you deal with the issues on climate change, and the fact that there is uncertainty, rather than saying this is how we get an intervention on the ground. Another thing that we've identified is the real importance of actually bringing knowledge systems together. We call it the best of knowledge, bringing the best of science, and that includes GIS and remote sensing and all that, together with local knowledge. And basically that, I would say that partially can be achieved by thinking of spatial planning in a nested sense. That some of the broader spatial plans are really more about putting the big picture contours in place and then starting to work as one goes down to the municipal and to the district and to the community level, and with more detail and filling in those details. And I think one of the key things is that communities need to be empowered to really fill in the details of a spatial plan. Interestingly, applies, one of the first areas that was identified was in where I live now, not where I'm from, but in Switzerland. And Switzerland actually started back in the 1850s. It had only 8% forest cover. It suffered a series of catastrophic landslides, and they started to put in place spatial plans to protect that. But the interesting thing was the real decisions of how this got configured on the ground were driven at the community level, and the broad contours were put in at the federal and cantonal levels. And then finally, I think this issue, one that I think hopefully that segues quite nicely with what Barbara was saying, was at the national or subnational level, I would say coherence and complementarity between sectoral policies are more important than clearly delineated lines and maps. So that's that. And now I've got a few concluding remarks, but I'll keep those for later.
Thank you,
okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh God, so many things, huh? So, Alfred, you are an experienced planner, you know, in this country, in this federal country, you know, who works for a federal agency for nature conservation. So what is in your experience what the German federal agency does on spatial and land use planning. Can you tell us a little bit more on that and elaborate specifically what the agency does on that?
Yes, I will do. I will try. Thank you very much for the invitation at the first. Please allow me to tell you something as an introduction on spatial planning in Germany, because it is necessary to give you an impression what spatial planning in Germany is before I start to talk about what BFN is doing in this context. In order to understand and classify the topic of land use planning in Germany, I have to give this introduction. In principle, we must distinguish between land-based spatial planning, marine or maritime spatial planning, and the various sectoral plans. They are all land use plannings and tools of land use plannings, but they are not spatial plans at all. They are not coherent regarding all topics. Today I will confine myself to spatial planning because this is the topic of this discussion forum. Land-based spatial planning in Germany takes place essentially at the level of the Länder, our states, the regions and the municipalities. In the area of the exclusive economic zone of the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, there is a maritime spatial planning for which the federal government is responsible. At the Länder level, there is state spatial planning, or shorter state planning. It provides a very basic framework and is not very detailed. The level of the German regions is already a municipal planning level. A planning region in Germany is an association of administrative districts and municipalities, and these make the planning decision for their region. In doing so, it concretizes the basic framework of state planning. As the third step, each municipality draws up a very concrete land use plan for its urban development. This plan must not deviate from the objectives of state or regional planning. We thus have an ever finer and more detailed system of spatial planning in Germany. The legal requirements for spatial planning come from spatial planning law, we call it Raumordnungsgesetz, and from urban planning law. The concern of nature conservation, including the landscape, are elaborated in Germany at the planning levels mentioned above, parallel landscape plans. They all show the state of nature and landscape. Relevant contents are, for example, habitats, species that occur in this area, and what is the state of the habitats and what is the state of the species. At the same time, these landscapes plans show important recreational areas for the population and landscapes that are characterized by outstanding beauty, for example. While spatial planning formulates development objectives for land use, landscape planning shows spatial objectives for nature conservation and the preservation and development of habitats and species and the landscape. Landscape planning in Germany is based on nature conservation law. Those tools are working close together. In many of our states, the office responsible for the spatial planning is also responsible for drawing the landscape plans, involving the conservation authority. They must ensure that they take into account the important and for the decision relevant nature conservation objectives. So, and what is BFN doing in this topic? Our role, the role of the Federal Agency for Nature Conservation in Land Use or Land-Based Spatial Planning focuses on the development of methodological standards for landscape planning, the implementation of research projects on important nature conservation issues in planning, and the submission of recommendations for the consideration of nature conservation standards in planning. We support model landscape planning projects on a regular basis in order to demonstrate how such plans can be drawn up at a good technical level and how nature conservation objectives can thus be integrated in spatial planning. We are therefore not directly involved in the land-based spatial planning process through our activities. However, we influence the work and professional standards in the federal states and provide a great deal of specialist information. To support federal planning and to give a national framework for state and regional planning, last year we drew up a federal green infrastructure concept. This bundled many of our previous activities there. The maps are digitally available and provide nationwide relevant goals and information for nature conservation. Contents include classic topics such as protected areas, e.g. national parks, biosphere reserves, and so on, but also the areas of Germany's national heritage or important habitats, such as National Biotopes Network and European Natura 2000 networks, and so on. An important part of this green infrastructure is also a concept for the reconnection of habitats. In a high densely settled area like Germany, you have a lot of cutoff of linkages for habitats and biotopes. And we showed in this concept the bottlenecks of the habitat networks and showed the infrastructure authorities, for example, where they could connect these linkages. So if there are questions on this green infrastructure concept, I can ask them otherwise afterwards. I only want to go on to a last point. This is the marine spatial planning. Sure. Okay, I will conclude, yes. As I told, BFN is responsible, the federal government is responsible for marine spatial planning. And the federal agency provides all the contributions for the marine spatial planning on nature conservation. So we are responsible for all this. And in this kind, we are directly part of the planning process because it's happening on federal level.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Sorry for being so persistent with the time, but now I would like to open the floor for some questions to the panelists. So raise your hands, please, if you have any questions. If not, we will have another session with another round of questions and answers. I think that we have covered a broad band of issues relating to community action, participation, oceans, the different tools that we should consider, in the planning. We have discussed forest landscape restoration, the issue of values, land, inclusiveness, ownership. If you do not feel like having any questions, that's fine. Let's see, what happens with the next round of participants. I will ask then the three of you can stay or you can leave, because thereafter I will invite you to come back. Perhaps you would like to take a seat there while I'm asking the next three speakers to come to the front. Stephen Nindi is the Director General of the National Land Use Planning Commission of Tanzania. Stephen holds a PhD in political ecology and a master in agricultural engineering, has 20 years of experience working on sustainable land resources management, ecosystems and biodiversity conservation, agricultural and rural development, environmental management, climate change, and food security. The second speaker, Cecilia Mgwengwe. She is the principal planner at the Department of Physical Planning of the Ministry of Local Government in Zambia. Cecilia has gained expertise at local level in 3 planning authorities, provinces like Lusaka, Southern and Central provinces, and has participated in the preparation of integrated development plans for several districts. She administers the law that guides her country Urban and Regional Planning Act for effective and efficient development, control, and project management and implementation. The last panelist, Christopher Kaoma, is the head of Spatial Planning for Wildlife, Protected Areas for the Department of National Parks and Wildlife of the Ministry of Tourism and Arts of Zambia, and is the principal investigator of Southern Africa Science Service Center for Climate Change and Adaptive Land Management. Tasks 190 conflicted land uses, agriculture versus wildlife, a joint initiative of Angola, Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, Zambia, and Germany, responding to the challenges of global change. So, distinguished speakers, I will start with Stephen. The National Land Use Planning Commission of your country seemed to be quite powerful as an institution. Can you tell us what exactly the Commission does in this particular field? And what is your personal and professional experience in ensuring interagency coordination to balance, the different interests and multiple conflicting needs and ensure long-term environmental benefits? Again, I will ask you all to respond in 5 minutes, if possible, yeah?
Thank you, Alejandro, and thank you so much for the audience. As I was introduced, my name is Stephen Nindi. The National Land Use Planning Commission of Tanzania was established way back in 1984 with really the strong connection between the civil society and the state. Especially the IUCN worked so hard with the government of Tanzania to establish the National Land Use Planning Commission way back in 1984. And at that time, in Tanzania, we had no land use policy. We only had the ordinance that guided the land use in Tanzania. So at that time, both the government, private sector, the civil society institutions, and the other stakeholders, they found that there was a very weak policy and the legal coordination on how best the land issues could be dealt with in Tanzania. So in result, for weak coordination, weak supervision, then we witnessed the increasing degradation of land-based resources, increased degradation of the biological species, and also increased conflict between the different land users. So that's why then the civil society, championed by the IUCN and the government, now found that it was pertinent then to establish the National Land Use Planning Commission, which was mandated as a national institution to coordinate, to supervise, and to lay standard on how best the land of Tanzania could be used. So in 1985, after so much hard work of the National Land Use Planning Commission, plus the presidential inquiry, we managed to establish the National Land Use Policy in Tanzania. And in 1999, we managed also to establish 2 acts, the National Land Act, and number 4, which is highly based on the urban spatial planning, and the Village Land Act number 5 of 1999, which is largely based on the spatial planning, especially for the rural landscapes, and other subsequent laws, including the new Land Use Planning Act, which was also established in 2007. And also, the National Land Use Planning Commission managed also to establish the regulations and the guidelines, the participatory guidelines, how best now the rural landscapes of Tanzania can be planned. And we do this in Tanzania by, in a very participatory way, whereby the public sector, the private sector, the civil societies come together, including the communities, to chart out how best these policies, laws can be formulated. So it's not a matter of for whereby the land fellows can craft the laws, can craft the policies, but in Tanzania, it's something that we all chart out at the nation to co-create the policies, the laws, the guidelines, and the other important tools that enable us to do the spatial planning, both in urban areas and the rural areas. And more recently now in Tanzania, through the National Land Use Planning Commission, which is the national level planning authority, but we have also the district councils, which are responsible for the planning for the particular or respective district, but so the village councils. In Tanzania, the land of Tanzania, which is almost 1 million square kilometers, 70% of it is a village land, village managed by the communities. So the communities, through the village council, these autonomous planning authorities, and the district council also their planning authorities, and the National Land Use Planning Commission is also, at the national level, is a physical planning authority, as far as the rural landscape planning is concerned. But when it comes to urban spatial planning, we have another kind of arrangement. So you can see, since it was established way back in 1984, we have tried real hard to work to reach out to more communities. In Tanzania, we are more than 12,500 villages, and we are now trying to get close to 13% of all villages to have a village land use plan, which are in fact made and established by the communities by themselves, of course, by the help of the district councils, the civil society organization, and the private sector. So this is the brief history of the physical planning processes in Tanzania, especially for the rural-based landscape is concerned. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Stephen. Let's move now to another country, and I would like to ask Cecilia, as a principal planner in the Ministry of Local Government, what is your main work, Cecilia? And does your ministry play a role in coordination like the one we just heard in Tanzania?
Okay, thank you so much. I think I'll start by saying that I'm working at national level. And so I'm part of a team that works on policy, guidelines, and therefore we guide the other levels of administration, the provinces and the districts, on how they should carry on with planning issues. I think my role at the ministry is that of administering the law that guides planning in Zambia. And this is the Urban and Regional Planning Act, number 3 of 2015. This was enacted in 2015, August, meaning this is not the initial law that we've had in Zambia. We've had other laws before. We've had the Town and Country Planning Act, I think Act 475, and then we had also CAP 293, and these were repealed by the Act number 3 of 2015 because they became old and archaic and therefore could not respond to the contemporary issues that are coming up in the planning field. So I think I'll talk briefly about the objectives of the Urban and Regional Planning Act.
And perhaps if you can explain your experience in trying to reconcile urbanization with environmental needs. If you can emphasize a little bit on that, because I know that you have experience on that. Yeah? Thank you.
Okay. So I think maybe I should talk about the objectives of the URP first, which are to promote and encourage development in the entire country. And this is supposed to be balanced. Development and conservation should be balanced. so that we have that balanced kind of picture. And then we are also aiming to decentralize the planning system. We are also trying to expand the planning to strengthen integration through the integrated development plans at district level. Also to improve the living conditions, to simplify administrative procedures because they used to be very complicated and therefore people could not comply, and also to encourage public participation. This is a very big thing in the current law because whatever plans are prepared without public participation, they shall not be approved. And then it also aims to plan for sustainable, orderly, and affordable development, looking at maybe cheap materials and local materials to come up with especially dwelling houses. So I think the institutional framework is such that we have the national level, we have the regional level, which is ad hoc, it's not permanent. It's appointed by the minister whenever there is need to prepare a regional plan. We have provincial planning authorities, we have local planning authorities as well. And the local planning authorities are the most active in this whole planning framework because that's where the implementation takes place. Okay, so the minister is like the principal planner of the whole country, and all the approvals, the final approvals are done by him. And then we have other legislation which support the Urban and Regional Planning Act to ensure that issues of biodiversity, conservation, and climate change adaptation issues are mainstreamed into the plans. So we have the Forest Act, we have the Zambia Environmental Management Act. This ensures that each development that is done is, okay, I think I'm running out of time, is aligned to the act, the provisions that ensure that there is biodiversity conservation and climate change issues are mainstreamed in those plans. So I think I will straight away talk about the integrated development plan because this is the plan that is prepared at district level where all the activities happens. So this is like the principal planning instrument that is at a regional level and informs all planning in the area of a local authority. And this now talks about protecting ecologically sensitive areas. It talks about environmental management. It talks about protection and care of environmentally, culturally, and historically significant places or buildings. So I don't know how much time I have, but what I can say is that the current law in Zambia on land use planning incorporates so much issues of environmental protection. Yes, compared to the previous laws that we've had before. Yes, and I've worked with the district levels. I've worked with several districts to prepare integrated development plans, and the content of the integrated development plan is such that they should take care of these sensitive areas which need to be preserved.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Reserve some final observations for the end. So Christopher, so as head of the Spatial Planning Unit of the Wildlife Protective Areas of Zambia, can you please tell us how your work looks like? What are the challenges that you face? What is exactly the nature of your work? And particularly, how do you link, let's say, conservation with climate change commitments, if you can elaborate on that specifically?
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair, for that question. First and foremost, before I talk about the role, or our role as a spatial planning unit, allow me to just explain the protected area systems of Zambia. Zambia is a country in southern Central Africa, and it is about 752 square kilometers. 31% of this country is set aside as wildlife protected area. So we are actually talking about 236,000 hectares. And the way the protected area systems in Zambia is made, we have the national parks, and around the national parks we have what we call the game management areas. In the national parks, it is clear because this is purely state land, but around the buffer, which are the game management areas, under our jurisdiction, the land is under customary tenure, meaning it is under the jurisdiction of the chiefs. And there are also multiple land uses. This is where spatial planning is very, very critical. We also do spatial planning within the national parks. Our planning, GIS and remote sensing is actually very, very critical because we need to identify where we have the critical flagship species, both in terms of vegetation and wildlife, both fauna and flora. There are also sometimes within this 31%, we also have wetlands. So we are also managing breeding sites, could be of fish and other species. And the way we do it, we usually zone these areas through the formulation of general management plans. So the areas are well zoned depending on the ecological significance of biodiversity in each particular area. But you can never manage a wildlife protected area without development. So it is also the role of the Spatial Planning Unit to ensure that conservation and development are actually done on a sustainable basis. So this is where the challenge comes in. The other challenge that we have faced with the planning in protected areas, especially in game management areas, which is under the custodianship of our traditional rulers, is that we've gone in with the Western kind of thinking. We are using the law passed by Parliament to give them the do's and don'ts. But I think the experience is that, and one thing that we have learned is that the traditional norms and culture are very, very critical in an African society. Because there are certain people who they call themselves as hunters by birth. But we are there. We have designated areas as national parks. And a protected area category as a national parks, you are not supposed to do hunting in that particular area. And these are the people who lived in that area many, many years ago. And they are always arguing that we still have wildlife. You found the wildlife. We lived here for many years. We never finished the wildlife, but we still harvest it on a sustainable basis. You may wish to know that historically, we used to hunt using spears and stones. We did not have automatic rifles. But here comes the safari hunter and other weapons which can kill 30, 40 impalas within a few minutes. So this is one of the challenges that we've been having. We are lucky at the moment because we've got a very, very strong act. Because the Zambia Wildlife Act states that any development in a wildlife protected area should be in conformity with the provisions of the General Management Plan. So all the do's and don'ts should be into conformity. But we still have a challenge of encroachment. because we might have ignored the norms and traditions of the local people. I may continue talking and talking, but for now, I think I'll end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christopher. It's your time to ask questions to the panelists. There is one there. I don't know if you have microphones, if you can help me with that. I have one there. I have a second person there. And I will take 3 maximum, please, at this stage, at least just to start. Well, after that, if you can introduce yourself and say to which of the panelists your question is directed to.
Hello, my name is Jan Fesa, Value for Nature Consulting. I have a question for Dr. Nindi from Tanzania. You mentioned that out of the 12,500 villages in Tanzania, about 13% now have a spatial plan. Is that right?
Yes.
So my question is, what were the bottlenecks that prevented the country from going to 100% of the villages in the last 20 years having a plan? And what are your strategies to get to those 100%? Thank you.
Should I ask?
Yes, please.
Young, thank you so much. The physical planning processes in Tanzania has a little bit a long history, pre-colonial, colonial time, post-colonial, and after the establishment of the Land Use Planning Commission way back in 1984. It was quite unfortunate that since it was established until very recently, the way the commission, the way the Minister of Lands was working, it was sector-based. Mm-hmm. So there was much little integration with the other sectors to work so hard to contribute to the spatial planning with the Ministry of Lands, Housing and Human Settlement. But I can echo to what Jandro asked me, what's your experience? Since my appointment to the Minister of Lands, to this position, I've tried so hard also to make sure that there is coordination, there is a collaboration across sectors. There is collaboration out of the sectors, but other stakeholders as well. As I speak to you now, that I have tried to forge a very comprehensive linkage with the national parks of Tanzania, whereby we have more than 400 villages surrounding the national parks, and the National Park Authority of Tanzania. They have committed almost 4 billion Tanzanian shillings to carry out village land use plans of all those villages surrounding the national parks of Tanzania. And I speak to now my team. They are in the field now doing the village land use plans until they finish these 400 villages. As well, I've also tried to manage a collaborative activity with the Tanzania Forest Services, whereby more than 8,000 villages will be having maybe a village land use plans in 5 years to come. So we have already started the work. So you can see that within this very short time, at least more than close to 9,000 villages will be under village land use planning processes that we think with the collaboration now, and we have worked so hard with the non-state actors, including the CSOs. I work closely with more than 40 CSOs in Tanzania to carry out village land use plans in Tanzania. And thanks to the ICN with the project of integrated land planning in Tanzania, land use planning in Tanzania, we have managed to work in several other villages. And there are so many other CSOs now, NGOs now, in the private sector. We work together to make sure that maybe in 10 years, the plan is that in 10 years, we can do all the village land use plans in Tanzania. But there are two main kind of bottlenecks that we're facing. I think, Johan, you know that we have been for so long using very obsolete technologies. Barbara, I told you that there is technology, the spatial technology out there in the north, but the accessibility of this spatial technology in the south has been very, very limited. So this is one of the bottlenecks that we are still using maybe very old systems. Our capacity and the capability to access the technology is limited. And the second one is also the mobility and the institutional capacity then in terms of personnel and in terms of mobility. As I said, Tanzania it has a square kilometer of close to 1 million square kilometers. And we have almost 12,450 villages. To reach out to all these villages, it means we need very efficient kind of mode of mobility. And these are the institutional challenges which we are working so hard to resolve in Tanzania. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much. Second question, please. There is.
Yes, I can speak up. You can hear me.
We can, yes.
My name is Boris. I'm working for GIZ. And this morning we had a great discussion in this room about territorial development. And there were so many issues discussed which were also reflected here. And we were wondering about the readiness to take up a territorial approach to develop in many of our partner countries. And I was thinking that it's a question directed actually to all three of you. How can spatial planning on decentralized levels actually help to inform a better, more coherent and better integrated policy on national level that reflects down for new investments in specific areas? And the key is cross-sectorial approaches. So I would be interested to get your opinion on that.
And I will invite the three previous panelists to come to the front, because I think you might have to say something about that. Who would like to start? I think this gentleman, this colleague from GIZ, is challenging all the panelists to give an answer to that. Huh? Or you want us to have another session after that very, very comprehensive? Any of you? I mean, I think that the question is directed to any of you. Yeah? Start, please.
Okay, let me just start as a context. When we talk about modern spatial planning now, we talk about multi-scale. So you're right. There is the need for a community level scale, because that's the implementation spot. And those are the people that are going to be committed and have self-compliance, et cetera. But they cannot be without guidance in the next level. So it's a two-way. It's not top-down. It's not bottom-up. It's two-way now. With modern spatial planning, the National Spatial Plan and the institutions that manage that have to provide the national framework. And as we move forward with technology, and geospatial technology especially, the national level is going to have a better and better set of tools to coordinate with the regional level, regional meaning multinational in this case, and then the global levels. We have global, multinational, especially transboundary, national, provincial, and local, and it should be consistent, but implementation is down. Policy, capacity building, finances are up, and I think that the example from Tanzania and Zambia on the IUCN project is a very good example of territorial coordination.
And just to echo to what Barbara was saying, that in Tanzania, we have close to 5 or 6 levels of spatial planning. Let me start with the village level. A village, like a semi-autonomous planning authority, their planning process is typical integrative, whereby all land-based resources are part of that planning process. And when we find that some of the resources overlaps to next village, next administrative boundary, the law allows to develop the joint village land use plans. And this allows up to maybe a joint of up to 5 villages. So 5 villages, they can have a comprehensive plan on how best they can use their land-based resources. And when it goes beyond that, the law allows to develop a framework, a district framework plan that allows how best now the land-based resources of the particular districts can be used, can be managed. And if the resources goes beyond a district administrative boundary, then we develop the so-called zonal. And recently now we are introduced with this landscape approach. Maybe for, like as you said, more than 20 years we have been working on the forest landscape. But for us now we're thinking of an integrative landscape whereby several other faculties of the land are involved in the planning process. Not only land, not only forest, but all other faculties of water, the human resource itself, forest, wildlife, they all co-create one integrative plan. And when we have the national integrated land use framework plan, it shows at that large scale how best the land-based resources of the country are planned and can be used. And the more recent now, we are forging forward to reduce the territorial kind of planning by knowing that some of the land-based resources and the biological resources, they exist and the spatial disputes may be beyond one national, beyond one state administrative territory. So we are now having, like as you say, we develop the landscape approach whereby two nations, for example, Zambia and Tanzania, they can have a framework plan whereby how they develop a system where how they can manage their resources. We also do the same for the Mozambique and the Tanzania through the Nyasa, Selu landscape. We also do the same for the management of the wildlife between Kenya and the Tanzania. So this is how we are trying to address the issues of not only just focusing on a particular administrative locality, but also think wide, maybe beyond one landscape or beyond one state to integrate other states that we share common resources. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other views on that? Or no? Any other questions? I think we are, yes, please. Microphone, please, thank you. No, we cannot hear you. Thank you.
For the presentations. That was really interesting. My name is Barbara Pollini. I work for the World Conservation Monitoring Center in Cambridge. My question is really around spatial data. I wonder in Tanzania and Zambia, I imagine that you don't have all the spatial data that you need in order to develop your land use plans. And so and it's a big challenge for everybody. So how do you overcome this kind of challenge? So how do you develop your land use plans if you don't have a good resolution of your spatial data? Thanks. It's for everybody, these questions.
Zambia first, yeah?
Okay, thank you so much for that question. I think spatial data is a challenge for sure, and we've been trying as countries to just make do with what we have. We do have GIS programs that we use for us to come up with spatial data that we can use in our land use planning. And I think we still use the old methods that we used to use in old-time geography. We still use that technology to consolidate the data that we together with the GIS data that we collect now, come up with the land use plans that we can, be able to come up with. I think it's a struggle, but I think we are forging ahead, and we are trying to get new technology. Yeah.
In case of Tanzania, of course, we have generic problems, challenges as Zambia have, but we have different levels how we address this. The first one, currently we are working with DFID, CEDA, and to have a pilot district 3 pilot districts whereby we do spatial planning, including the urban and the rural areas, and we could access through this partnership high-resolution imageries of 0.5 meters. So at that small scale, kind of 3 districts, and in Tanzania we have almost 186 districts, so you can see a workload ahead of us. And indeed, I want to acknowledge that after this meeting, I want to meet you so that we can discuss on this. The second level is like, as I said, we really work so hard to collaborate with the private sectors and the CSOs to see how we can bridge this gap. Johan, we also work with the national states, other national states, to address this issue. The government of Netherlands, the government of Germany through GIZ, they're trying to work with us, mostly at a project or pilot level. But at a national level, we really have this challenge to address the issue of spatial data. So maybe your college, your institutions can also try to be part of this system, trying to address, because Tanzania is a home of numerous biodiversity richness in the world, and the value of the importance of maintaining this cannot be just rested on the shoulders of the Tanzania, such a poor country. I think it's our global responsibility to make sure that we protect and we conserve not only the biodiversity, but also the human being that protects this biodiversity in that country. Thank you.
Thank you. I need to wrap up, sorry. So just before leaving, the focus on the forum this year is commitment to action. And before closing, I would like to ask each of the panelists to leave us a key message on this issue, considering also this motto of commitment to action. Can you start, please?
Yeah. Okay. Things are done different around the world. That's what we had heard now. But in my opinion, there are 3 key elements which are needed for spatial planning. The first we need clear rules, which means clear and enforceable legal obligations to integrate the interests of nature and landscape. This makes them an integral part of the planning process and makes it clear what needs have to be taken into account. This is the first point. The second point is we have to provide the necessary and appropriate information on nature and landscapes. And as we discussed already, this point, it's not so easy to have all this appropriate information. Then the third point is use the power of public. The participation of the public is a very important driver for the enforcement of the interests of nature and landscape. The political will of the planning authorities to consider the interest of nature and landscape is, of course, always decisive. And in many planning cases, it would like to emphasize in many planning cases, I would like to emphasize we see a great openness and a great awareness for this concern. However, the 3 above-mentioned points ensure that the interests of nature and landscape are taken into account more or less equally in spatial planning. Thank you.
Thank you. Barbara?
Well, action means start now. We're seeing this in other fora. Now, then one is going to say, but we don't have a new spatial planning law. We don't have a comprehensive framework. Start with what you have. You have so many instruments in your legal tool basket that even the folks that are administering programs know, and if they are posed with the right questions, they can help find those tools and make them work. You have your entire platform of conservation legislation, for one thing. You have your entire platform of fiscal legislation. You have your platform of development legislation. That's just to name a few. That's number 1. Number 2, we are living in a world of dynamism and change that we do not even understand where it's going, right? So be sure you keep following the science. Good science, I mean, you can make judgments, but the science, best available science for climate change, for biodiversity, for human development, for socioeconomics, that's what, you need to listen to that, and you need to be part of it. Get your degrees in these areas and be part of the science that informs the people, which then can help build the policy and law. The third one, don't forget the ocean. The ocean is affecting the land. Even if you're not coastal and you're inland, you are eating the fish or you are breathing the air. Keep thinking about the land, sea, coastal linkages, and don't forget those when you plan your river systems and your sewage waste. Make sure it doesn't get into your ocean.
Thank you. Christopher?
Thank you very much, Chair. My key message is that spatial planning is about zoning, the zonation of an area into different land uses. So my message is that it is important to consider in every society, not only an African society, in every society, the culture. Instead of just considering the laws of parliament, the legislation, we need to know the history, how people lived in that particular society. And then we put together the current legislation and have the solution at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Cecilia?
Okay, I think what I'm going to say is that issues of biodiversity, conservation, and climate change, mitigation, and in our case, adaptation, I think require concerted effort. Each one of us has a role to play, so we need to, I think, take our roles very seriously and bring whatever we have to bring to the table so that we can come up with long-lasting solutions towards this issue that we have at hand. I think that's my key message.
Thank you. Stephen?
Thank you, Alejandro. For me, coming from the South, when it comes to sustainable environmental management, sustainable biodiversity or natural resource management, these are the issues that really requires strong institutional capacity building. The North and South should work together to ensure that there is a very strong institutions, especially those are responsible, direct or indirect, into the management of these global-based resources. And the second is also the importance of democratic governances, especially for the South. You know, these resources, as my colleague Chris has said, that they are surrounded, or even within, living within the communities, within our people. So when we have democratic governance that also listen to the voices, either the vocal or the hidden voices of our people, on how best they can manage, how best they can benefit to this, to me is very, very important. And another level is that they know they also should also listen to the national interests. Our nations also, they have interests. Our regions also, they have interests. And they also have interests at a global level. So let's chat together. Let's live together. Let's work together to make sure that the whole cross-section from the capacity or institutional building, democratic governance, and the national or regional or global interests are well kept, are well maintained. And to do this, I echo to what Barbara said, we have really to invest in science. We work so hard in science, but to collaborate, maybe there are voids in the South of which they know that maybe you have plenty of it in terms of technology. Let's share these technologies in terms of the hardware, the software, the human resources in a free and a juxtaposed movement. Thank you so much.
Thank you. To end. Stuart.
Yeah, so it's difficult to follow. But I'll maybe just a couple of reflections just to build on some of this. I mean, I think spatial planning, at the heart of spatial planning is decision-making about land use, and that makes it a governance process. It really, and therefore I think to the success and to the utility of spatial planning, it really depends how we approach it. If we approach, and I think one of the things we've started off, and this has been highlighted several times, we started off in a very expert-driven way, and I think we've heard now the importance of bringing in culture, bringing in different perspectives, nested planning, that it's not all about lines and maps drawn in the capital city. So I would say maybe three things, three reflections on how we approach it. Number one, I think good spatial planning mediates change processes across landscapes rather than trying to fix land use configurations in perpetuity, because I tell you, change will continue to happen and needs will change, and so we'll be continuing running to catch up. So I think really sort of as a basis to help mediate change process, I think would be the first thing. That means it provides an adaptive framework rather than a fixed blueprint that's it, somehow it's there, this is it, and this is the line you've, yeah. And finally, that it provides a platform for stakeholders to make explicit and negotiate trade-offs rather than a framework for experts to optimize or to determine optimal outcomes. And I think then, I'd maybe just like to go back to that last question about what about the data? Because I think I would come back to, I think with Cecilia's point, you'll only never have enough data if you want to come up with the perfect blueprint. You start with what you've got. I think Barbara said this as well. Start with what you've got. That's been our experience in 35 countries. You can work this through because it's not just what the experts determine. It ultimately comes down to village land use plans. So there are a range of voices in that. So yeah, anyway, that's the... Yeah.
We have come to the end of the session almost sharp on the time, so that allows you to go to the next one. But before doing that, can I have a round of applause to all the panelists? Thank you very much to everybody for having come to this event. I wish you a good continuation of the forum, and thank you. And yeah, we mentioned that we have another event tomorrow morning. Nick presented that at the beginning, 10 a.m. in the Learning Pavilion. We will introduce the capacity development materials on integrated land use planning. You're all invited to join us. Thank you.